So I'm here to talk about my friend Larry, and I'm gonna title this "By the Way," and I'll explain "By the Way," and some of your smilings, you'll get it, you know it right away. But I'm gonna tell you more about that title, which is one of Larry's favorite phrases, in just a minute. But it was my pleasure, my honor to count Larry as a friend for close to a decade. And I want to start off. By the way, I need to explain something. I'm going to work with a script because Megan said I'm a little crazy that way. I'm not like Larry could just ad-lib beautifully on this, and I wanted to make sure that I got this right. Besides, school started today for me, and so it's like, no, Rick, you're just gonna. All right. So anyway, this is for and about our friend Larry. So, as you know, Larry was an old hippie and a big fan of all things related to human rights and everything. So I want to start off by citing a civil rights pioneer. Vincent Harding was a historian, a civil rights pioneer, and he also wrote speeches for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, I'm not sure how much Larry knew about Vincent Harding. They were the same generation, but Larry believed passionately in civil rights. So I'm confident he would have approved when Vincent Harding said that our lives can and should be signposts for what is possible in the world. And in that, Harding offered us the image of what he called live human signposts on the paths of people who, by the way they simply conducted their lives, pointed the way toward a more diverse, enlightened, and democratic future. So, for me, Larry was a human signpost, and tonight I want to share with you 3 brief stories about journeys Larry took and the lessons that I took from each one. So the first 2 journeys are about my experiences traveling with Larry to events in the Twin Cities, and I have students out there. And the last is about how he, come on in if you want to. Yeah.
Come on in. We snuck away from the room just to speak.
Yeah, come on in. We're gonna. So, and the last story is about them, about Larry landing in Minnesota. Okay, and his daughter Zena is here with us tonight. So I mean, and you could correct me in any facts. Okay. So, but before I get going too far, I know what some of you may be thinking, right? Larry was not perfect. I mean, he lived in many, many places from coast to coast. He collected lots of stuff, including stamps, baseball cards, books, more books, lizards, college degrees, all the usual stuff, right? But he also had an irrepressible love of life and people, and he was a raconteur, one hell of a storyteller. So the first signpost I want to talk about with Larry is amazement. Larry had unbridled enthusiasm for learning new things, and I think most of you know that. Shortly after I met Larry, about 8-9 years ago, Marcia and I traveled with him to the Minneapolis Institute of Arts to see the Rembrandt in America exhibit. To understand why that journey stands out for me, you need to understand that my family maybe sometimes refuses to go with me to museums. And my wife is walking in the door so she can verify. Come on in. I spend, when I visit a museum, I spend entirely too much time studying exhibits, reading plaques, and generally geeking out. Okay? And in Larry, I found my museum soulmate. Right? I mean, if I am a museum geek, Larry was a super geek. The paintings that I found interesting, he found to be just jaw-dropping. I mean, quite literally. And I can still see his face just light up with joy at nearly every turn as we worked our way slowly from one old oil painting to another, right? Now, I'm tempted to call that childlike amazement, except he didn't just stand there and sort of stare. You know, he wanted to talk about it. And, you know, I mean, any given painting could prompt a discussion about history, about philosophy, about class-based politics in Renaissance Europe, or that hot girl he chased in Las Vegas, you know, back in the 60s, right? I learned early on that although Larry might sometimes look sort of rumpled and unshaven and unsophisticated, looks can be deceiving, my friends. He was an extraordinarily intelligent, witty, and well-read person who never abandoned his joy for learning. Second signpost. This concerns human connections. A few years after that museum trip, a group of us traveled to a baseball game at Target Field in Minneapolis. And the Twins were playing the Yankees. Larry was really eager to see his two favorite teams in action. And two things stand out for me from that day. The first was that the Twins lost because Alex Blanking Rodriguez hit 2 home runs into the upper decks, right? The second thing I remember is that while I was cursing A-Rod, Larry was celebrating his favorite player and carrying on happy conversations with new people in all the surrounding seats. He was eager to tell anyone who would listen about how he had grown up in New Jersey as a Yankees fan. He'd been to Yankee Stadium, right, and all that. And although he had recently become a vegetarian, you know, that did not stick, by the way. He would make an exception for a ballpark hot dog and a cold beer, right? True story. I'm not sure that he shut up for more than 30 seconds in the entire game. You know, and if anyone else had tried that, they would have driven us all just crazy. But somehow, Larry pulled it off. That was his shtick, you know. I mean, he knew how to be charming with strangers. Now, an example. Sean and Misty Butler. Were you both there, or was just you, Sean?
It was just me.
It was just, okay, so Sean was there with us along with his dad, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, and Sean, I mean, Larry and Sean's dad had never met, but, you know, before that game was over, these two had, like, bonded over their love of baseball, right? Even though they, you know, they love different teams and all that. Classic Larry, and he just knew how to make friends when he traveled, right? So, third signpost, and this is about hope. I titled my story, By the Way, because as anyone who's ever had an extended conversation with Larry Montello knows, that was one of his favorite phrases. He used it to jump from one topic to another in random and often surprising ways. He might start by complaining about Donald Trump's latest tweet and then say, oh, by the way, right? And at that point, he would jump to some other entirely unrelated topic, like the history of some arcane German stamp, or Sandy Koufax's fastball, or the time back in the 60s when he hitchhiked coast to coast and did illegal things, right? After 3 or 4, maybe 5, 6 of those by-the-way side excursions, he would maybe then circle back to telling you how proud he was of his children for sharing his disgust at the politics of Donald Trump. So what does any of that have to do with hope? In his conversations, many of them had right here, like this table, in his conversations and in his life, Larry was a wanderer. He lived for a time in so many places I can't keep track of them, including New Jersey, Nevada, California, Florida, Oregon, Oklahoma, and of course Minnesota. I think 3 times, something like that. Yeah. And Minnesota is where he finally settled down to buy a home, raise a family, and make children. I asked Larry once, why, of all the beautiful places you have visited, you know, they chose to stay here. God knows they could have chosen someplace warmer, with fewer mosquitoes, fewer cornfields, right? And his responses stuck with me. He said, I know this word for word. He said it was the idea of Minnesota. When I asked him to explain, he said that he and Dawn were inspired by our state's tradition of hopeful and progressive politics. They wanted to raise their children in the state that produced leaders like Hubert Humphrey, Walter Mondale, and later Amy Klobuchar. He was a big fan. A state that has a history of funding public education, and he stressed that, not to mention the nation's finest public radio network. Say what you will about Larry Montalvo. He loved his family. He was determined to raise a group of progressive Democrats, and he succeeded. He honestly believed that his children and their friends could change the world by fulfilling that hippie dream of peace, love, and human tolerance. And in that way, his life was about hope. Our friend Larry has now journeyed on. But I like to think that in his own distinctive ways, his life can serve as a signpost for many of us, pointing his family and friends forward to a future in which the politics of hatred has been defeated and everyone loved Rembrandt and baseball.